All right. Well, just if you joined late, just a quick introduction. I'm Jerry Gergel. I'm with the Customer Success Engineering team. You might have heard some of my other colleagues speak today. Have the great opportunity actually meeting our customers and running workshops. So I plan to share some lessons learned and some tips and tricks.
Thanks, Jerry. I'm Melanie Latin. I'm on the customer education team, which is part of the same team Jerry's on with customer success. So thanks for tuning in. Appreciate it.
Oh, did the screen not move forward, or are
There
you?
we go.
All
That
right.
just took a minute. Thank you, Jerry.
All right.
So after our presentation, you'll be able to squash vulnerabilities in your OSS component. So Jerry and I will help you be able to answer these questions. Where do I start? How do I know what the vulnerabilities are? What should I do about them? And is there a workflow or best practice?
So as we sat down and thought about what we'd like to share, we've got probably 4 tips that I think if every customer could do this to start, it would be great. But for context, why are we going to be sharing these specific things with you? When you look at some of the data that's been collected, and I think for some of the developers that I'm speaking to, you are in the middle of this and you may have a good feel. But for those who don't, any of the components that are out there in the open source community, they have a number of vulnerabilities associated to them. We know that piece. But then when you look at applications, they can consist of hundreds of components. So when you look at like what you're producing and putting out there to be used, they can have hundreds of components, and any one of those components could have a number of vulnerabilities. So the topic today really is where can I find these vulnerabilities? What should I do about them? And I want to let those numbers kind of sink in a little bit for those who haven't seen them before. And then think about this a little bit. So I'm going to come at it from a little different direction. The software supply chain report that Derek was talking about has some interesting questions and statistics. From an older report, we were talking to developers about DevOps practices. And so the underlying question in all these numbers here really is: Do you have an open source governance policy? Um, Shockingly, even those that have a good DevOps practice or be categorized as a good or elite DevOps practice, they either don't have a policy or they're ignoring it. So I started thinking about this. I started thinking about the number of components that are out there to make up an application, some of the average statistics you see, and I get to meet customers and I can hear how large their applications and how complex their applications are. And then I started thinking about the fact that we're really a security conscious community now, and then you look at this statistic and go, well, wait a second, there's got to be something behind this. Why aren't they? And I think it's as simple as that developers have a lot on their plates. And there's a lot of versions of components out there, and there's lots of different variations to components out there. And it's very, very difficult for the development community to even have a good idea of what a good component is. So I think the reality here is all the developers want to do the best they can. I truly believe in that, and they do have security on their mind, but it's probably based on either old practices or incomplete information or a lack of access, where they really can't follow through on this promise of creating secure applications. So I'm going to jump to the end here really quick and say, where am I heading with this? We hear this time and time again from our customers that Nexus as a platform by itself, or even just Lifecycle, if you look at it, but our technology really does help save time. Again, as I mentioned, I'm really fortunate. I get to work with customers directly. In the last, I'd say, 5 months, I've run probably 4 different developer workshops, and it's remarkable how they want to embrace this. So the big thing here from the business perspective is just by leveraging and introducing technology like this, you really do have an ROI. You really can save time. And again, thinking about the developers, I want to show you some things if you haven't already seen it in Lifecycle. That's really valuable information, and it'll help you save time.
Okay, Jerry. So I'm a developer. You sold me. I'm ready to squash vulnerabilities. How do I get started?
Yeah, I think the first thing in Fernando's discussion earlier, talking about how to be champions in your organization, one of the slides he talked about were the phases we go through, and I really think that early on, what you need is an inventory. In other words, you don't know what you don't know. If you go back to some of the statistics about hundreds of components being in applications, here's another really interesting statistic. Most of our customers tell us that upwards of 80 to 90% of the applications they're deploying or putting out to market, they're 80, 90% of them are open source, meaning only about 10 or 20% is their business logic or their custom code. So the question then is, if I don't have an inventory, and if I don't, how do I know what I'm even using? This really all goes back to having a secure software supply chain. So the first thing I would recommend is just getting an inventory and having a bill of material of the components that are in your application. And you might sit back as a developer and say, well, where do I fit into the process, and what am I really suggesting? So let me go through, in a way, kind of the an ideal picture of what this would look like. So as developers, you're working as in teams or as individuals, and you're going out to begin work. I would suggest putting in your mind, architecturally or conceptually, the IQ server, Nexus Lifecycle, and firewall kind of on top of everything that you're doing. So as you go along, you're going to be pulling components out from public domain, from different repos, and you're going to be pulling those things down, and you're going to most probably be using some kind of a repo, Nexus Professional, or maybe Artifactory or something like that, and you're going to go off and develop code, right? That 10% or 15% of that business logic you're going to write, and then you're going to do some testing, and ultimately you're going to release that into production. With the IQ server and Nexus Lifecycle, what's going to be happening is seamlessly and in almost in step, right, in sync with what you're doing, it's going to be scanning those components and building that inventory for you. So to build an inventory, in a sense, I'm suggesting just simply use the IQ server as you develop, and I'll be talking about this more, but then you can be leveraging the policies that your organization set up. Now, if you're a small group and you happen to be listening to me and you're a small group of developers and you actually own the IQ installation and you're using Lifecycle, then it would be you setting up your policies. But in most large enterprises, and you've heard a lot about it earlier today in the other sessions, there'll be policies that'll be set up that are almost like guardrails or guides for you to know, do you have a good or a bad component? And again, the idea is that as you develop, these things are being kept in sync with the scans and by the IQ server, and it'll build up an inventory. And then just kind of future forward thinking as you go along, new vulnerabilities may be detected. So as you're doing your integration builds, or as you're doing QA, or you're about to release, you have the opportunity to do an evaluation of that application and all of its components to see if, just to make sure that you don't have something, some kind of a threat or a vulnerability that's kind of sneaking in as you do your development.
Okay, Jerry, I see where the developer fits in the process now. And you've talked a bit about starting with a policy. So could you tell us more about that? What's a policy?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in a very simple way, a policy are things like you're in a 25 mile per hour speeding zone, right? If you go faster than 25, you're breaking the speed limit, you're breaking the policy. You're in this no smoking area, or, I have kids, so I'm always telling them not to run around with scissors, right? If you do, you break a policy. But in all seriousness, it's things you can relate it to as a developer. There are things like you have to have a strong password, right? It has to have a certain minimum number of characters, uppercase or mixed case, and things like that. So that would be a policy. And if that application went into production or tried to go into production, hopefully you have procedures in place that would catch something like that, and someone would say, no, 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 we cannot be doing something like this. So that would be a failed policy. And that actually is what Nexus Lifecycle is doing, right? It's housing all the policies as you're doing these scans or as you're doing the downloads through firewall, right? It's evaluating that component against the policies, and it's serving as a guideline or giving you guides in terms of what the organization deems as acceptable. A lot of what I'll be talking about today will be around security violations, but there could be things about age of components. There could be other characteristics of that, that's part of the policy. But certainly, having a CVS score of 10 would be a very bad thing. That's a very high level threat, right? So you'd want to know about that. At the end of the day, the policies themselves, just to kind of round this out quickly, is there's 4 types of policies really that are going to be presented to you as a developer to help you understand do you even have a good component, or are you at risk? So as I said, we'll be talking about the security. There's also license information in terms of the types of licenses. All these things kind of build up to a bill of material. Architectural type policies, again, maybe if the component is really, really old, or if it's not popular, there are things there that you can take a look at. And then the component itself. Based on our data service and our curated data, we have a huge collection of all of the known components out in the ecosystems. And so maybe it's not an exact match, and that might cause you a question. So architecture, is it a known component, essentially, a license, information, and then policies around security.
Okay, so let me recap here for just a minute. So you say that Nexus Lifecycle takes my organization's policies and it evaluates my components. Then what happens? What do I see after that?
Yeah, that's okay. So basically you've got the inventory, right? So what next? What you'd see is this. I actually encourage developers to do this. There are some really great tools in the IDEs. It's interesting. Sometimes I run across developers as I work with customers that don't have access to the IQ server. I actually encourage developer access to IQ server. I think it's great if the sponsorship, maybe the organization, maybe security brought in, Lifecycle, and I think that's great. That's definitely a good sponsor. But I encourage developers to get in there, because what you're going to get is that bill of material. So it's essentially, without going through great description, there is a tool that's part of our suite that's going to scan your software, or you're going to add this to a Jenkins job, or a Bamboo, or some kind of a CI tool, which I'll talk about in a little bit. The result of that will be an evaluation report that might look like this. And I can see all of the different policy violations. So on that one column there, you can see the name of the policy, such as license banned or a security high. And then you could also see the threat level. So the threat level is again part of the policy. But example of a threat level 10 would be if there's a known vulnerability, National Vulnerability Database has a known vulnerability out there and it's got a CVS score of 10. That would be a very, very high threat. And in most cases, that's always going to be a threat 10 for our customers. But it's also going to give you a component list on the right-hand side showing you what the affected component is. So this really helps me as a developer, because maybe I didn't develop the application and I'm trying to get an understanding of where my threats are. I can simply come into Lifecycle. All you need is the URL from your administrator, user ID, and password, and you can start to take a look at the information that was a result of the evaluation. If you dig in a little bit, if you click on any one of those policy violations, you get more information as a developer. So here's, again, maybe you're not familiar with the component, but you'd like to know what the coordinates are, right? What's the group and the artifact and the version? We're starting to expose information like category. So if you didn't already know that this was something that managed XML or was something to do with data, you'd have some information about that. But more importantly, as a developer, on the right-hand side there, I have the histogram. In one of the earlier presentations today, I saw a nice discussion around how to go through that and look at that. Essentially, here, as well as in the IDE integrations, I'll show you in a second, I could come in here and know if I have a good or a bad component. I mean, it's pretty obvious here that I've got a high pulse. The highest policy thread on this component's a 9. That's pretty bad. The highest CVS score is a 7.5. That's also not so great. It's 5 years old. There's a lot of information here as a developer, where if I didn't have this, I'd have to start searching around and going to different links. And, basically our data team and our data science have curated and brought all this information together to put it right at the developer's fingertips. So what I would be doing here is digging in a little bit farther to say, well, what is the vulnerability? What is the attack surface? How do I even know if I'm vulnerable really? Some of the vulnerabilities might be related to runtime. So maybe if I'm not using that version of JBoss, or if I'm not on that operating system, maybe I'm not really vulnerable. But all of that information is right here for the developer to read. If there's information that's been captured around proof of concepts, all the advisories, again, it's all right here. And that time savings that we were talking about by our customers, this is probably one of the best representations. And I encourage developers to get out here and use this information. So yes, it is good to know that somebody opened a Jira ticket and you've got a vulnerability and you've got to upgrade a component. But if you also had this, you'd be armed with a lot of great information. So I kind of alluded to this, and this kind of goes back to how do you see things, Melanie, in terms of where can I find stuff? We have integrations to a number of tools. I've got a link down here that will actually show you more about our integrations. But three really popular integrations in the marketplace are Eclipse, IntelliJ IDEA, and the Microsoft Studio.NET integration. So this is just a little bit of a screenshot of what you see in all three of them. It looks the same. And what's really nice here is as I'm developing, so I don't have to wait for a build. I don't even have to wait for somebody to ask me to look at this. As I'm developing, I can be proactive. I can look at this and say, I'm working on this piece of code. I wonder what the condition of it is. Is it even a good component? I could take a look at the version of Xstream I'm using. I can see that it's red. I can see I've got policy violations, but I can also see that there's versions not too far ahead, meaning just a few versions up that I could bump to that have no known vulnerabilities. So talk about being proactive and putting the information into the hands of the people that can actually do something about this. Here, the developer can go ahead and be proactive. If I'm already working on this, why don't I just pick a version that's not vulnerable, refactor, test? I mean, you could avoid the whole hassle of needing to do rework, having information like this. Plus, feel good that you've got a pretty safe component. There is no known vulnerability here, so it's a much better position to be in as you move forward with that release. And just all this shows here, Melanie, is in the IDE. You see some of the same information being exposed in the perspective. You can get information around the CVE, or if it's a Sonatype notification in our database, you'd have the CVE or a Sonatype record down there with all the information that they can read.
That's pretty great, Jerry. I think that's pretty compelling reasons why to care in order to squash those vulnerabilities.
I love that
So
graphic.
now that yeah, I do too. That's hilarious. Um, so the violations have been identified, and what should I do next? What do I do about them?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of obvious why we care, right? Because we want to be security conscious. We want to put security first. And I went through all that background to kind of give an idea of, at least a high level idea of how it works as a developer and what you might see. Basically, I thought about this, and I took four things. There are a lot of things we talk about in our developers workshop. I took four things and I thought to myself, if everyone just started with these, if you're not already doing this, right? If you're just getting started on this as a developer, or this is all new to you, and you're just trying to figure out where to start or some tips, if you just did these four things, you'd be really well down the path. There's more you can do, don't get me wrong, but I thought, let's talk about four simple things you can do really as a developer, right? Number one, if you don't already have your application being scanned in your CI tool, set it up, right? Maybe you are part of the DevOps team. Go ahead and set that up. If somebody else owns that, ask to get that set up. The reason why you do that is this is how you're going to get the inventory. There's nothing else you have to do other than have that build step, initiate a scan, and work with the IQ server. And then all that information you saw will be at your disposal, the evaluation report. And then there's other reports too, and I'm just kind of hinting at it down here on the bottom, that you can have different phases. You can indicate what type of scan that is. Was that the initial build? Are you doing QA? Is this something that we're getting ready to do or a release on, right? It's the finished product and we're doing a release. But if you get that initial build set up, you're automatically going to start building an inventory. That's all you need to do. So that's tip number one. Tip number two, and Paige kind of the earlier session where she was talking about some of the things to help the developers. It was kind of funny. This is my number two tip. Start with the highest level threat. It's every once in a while, and I don't mean to do this when I meet customers. At the point where I start talking about next steps, it feels like there's a little bit of deer in headlights going on. They see the violations. There's a list in here. Remember I said there's, those statistics show there's over 100 components and there's 23 violations probably in each application that you're currently developing. And they see this long list and they don't know where to start. But it's really simple. Start with the highest threat. It's the highest threat for the reason. It's either a large attack surface, or it's extremely vulnerable, or it's being exploited. And if you mitigate that, then you're automatically making your application safer, and you're probably picking healthier, better components to work with. And then once you get through those 8, 9s, and 10s, focus on the lower level threats. Unless somebody has a urgent reason that they hand you, as a developer, I would just make sure I'm getting rid of the highest level threat that I see either in my application report or in my IDE as I'm working with a specific component. Tip number 3. Uh, Adam earlier talked about the traps of modifying open source. There's a lot of good things in terms of collaborating with open source projects and contributing, but he was talking about, like, be careful, because there are obligations around if you were to edit that software. And I think the trap here is what you want to do is you want to look at your direct dependencies. And what you want to do is focus on doing things like upgrading, and which I'll talk about in a minute, or or mitigating the actual vulnerability. Maybe it's a default configuration, right? Maybe it's something in the XML or something that was found. And if you make a modification to the configuration, in other words, the way you're running the application, then you mitigate your risk. So in terms of where you start in all these components and all these threats, definitely work with the direct dependencies in your project. And then if it's a transient dependency, if it's something being pulled in by, say, a framework, excuse me, or some kind of a parent project that it's pulling in, you would just basically switch context to that parent project and go through the same process. And then, as this kind of suggests, if you don't have direct access or can't modify that, you need to track that as technical debt, work with a team that does own that parent project, and kind of iterate through those threats. Excuse me. So start with the direct dependencies. If you find transitive dependencies, go to the parent project and kind of iterate through. That's really the easiest and probably the best way from an architectural perspective to keep your technical debt down and just kind of work through all the issues. Tip number 4, and this definitely gets into what kind of security violation we're really talking about, but save yourself the time. If you know there's a known vulnerability and you're not 100% sure when you're looking at it if it even is something where it can be exploited in your environment, why take the risk? Simply upgrade to a version of that component, if there's one available, that doesn't have the vulnerability. In other words, it was fixed by the open source project. This really lowers your technical debt. It lowers the attack surface. It's easy. We're providing you all the information quickly to be able to see those things. So pick the newer version that's not vulnerable, refactor, retest, and move on. It's going to be the quickest path forward. Now, in some cases, you might be stuck with a old version of a component, or maybe it's a framework or something that, in theory, has no known good version to it. It's just vulnerable. You have the opportunity to go and take a look at a component to maybe replace it if that's possible. Maybe you're picking a newer project, a newer component that doesn't have these vulnerabilities, and then of course you do your testing and you move on. And if those two things are not afforded to you, with all the information that's being provided in those vulnerabilities and in the Sonatype data, take a look, and then at that point, do some research to see if it is exploitable. Um, Oftentimes in there, it'll talk about either certain types of runtime or it'll talk about a certain type of configuration. And those things kind of are edge cases that create the situation where you can be exploited. And in that case, you're not really changing the version of the component, but you might be changing your configuration or your runtime a little bit, and then you can move on. So the fourth tip basically is pick a good component. Pick a component that doesn't have a vulnerability. Maybe swap out frameworks if that's possible for you, and then obviously use the data that's in the results to help you assess if you actually are exploitable.
Well, thanks, Jerry. You showed us how to squash those vulnerabilities. Appreciate that. You walked us through the process of now we know where to start, what the violations are, what we should do about them, and what the workflow looks like. So to sum up Jerry's 4 tips, those are listed here. So you're ready to go squash your vulnerabilities. You can add a scan step to your CI build. Start with the highest threats first. Remediate direct dependencies first. And find a component with no violations.
Oh, I forgot we put that in.
Can't forget that.
Yeah, I love that. So squash and smash away. So, all right, let's get on to this one.
Thank you. And so if you want to learn more, you're free to join the discussion in the Sonatype community. Join your peers there. The Sonatype experts are there as well to help you out. There's lots of great information on our online help site. There's tons of technical guides and quick start guides. And the integration guide Jerry mentioned earlier, the IQ server and IDE integrations is available there too. So check that out. And then last, join us in the Slack channel. Jerry and I will be in there for the next 30 minutes. If you have any questions, we're happy to talk to you.
Yeah, we'll jump over there. I want to give a quick shout out to you and the education team. There is a lot of material out there. If you're a customer and you haven't taken a look at these guides, or even the my.sonatype.com, take a look. Melanie and the team have done a great job building up a tremendous amount of information there for you to read and to learn how to use our software.
Thanks, Jerry. There's a lot of great information. I highly encourage you to check it out.